Now I invite Raphael to give his
Yeah, thank you. I think I shared the presentation with Emmanuel, and it would be nice if you can actually project that for me. Can we do that from the room?
We will project it from here.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you so much. And you hear me well?
Yes, Raphael, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. So, I mean, while we upload the slides on the screen, I'm just going to introduce myself briefly. I'm Raphaelle Martinez, and like I was introduced, I'm leading the technical team at the Secretariat of the Global Partnership for Education. So the work of my team, not just my sole work, is to mobilize evidence available across the partnership, to support uptake in policy dialogue, policy program design, but also to provide technical assistance in some areas where we see gaps in research, for instance, or even tools in the support of countries. So I'm very happy to be with you today to discuss climate and education. And I'm going to be presenting what the Global Partnership for Education, GP, is currently doing in the area of climate and education. But that's more for having also feedback and a discussion with you on what we could do more together as a coalition of actors. So not just the partnership, but really also partnering with researchers in particular, because my team is interested into translating evidence into policy action. And I'll try to limit myself to 20 minutes so we can have a moment for exchanging, but there's a lot to cover because I'd like to briefly introduce the GP so everyone is aware of what the partnership is, but also to discuss the framework for climate smart education systems that we just developed. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. If you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So briefly introducing the GPE, discussing about the climate smart education systems, and within that framework, there is one component on school and communities in particular that I would like to develop a little bit more. But also I see that as an opportunity for reviewing the evidence available that is working the nexus of climate and education, and from where we're sitting, discussing with you the evidence gaps that we're seeing and where more research efforts is necessary. So we can move to the next slide so I can introduce GP briefly for those that are less familiar with GP. So we're a global fund, we're lending grants. We're actually the largest global fund that is dedicated to education, but we're also a partnership of multiple stakeholders. And we're focusing our grant allocation in lower income countries. So we work with governments in nearly 90 countries, which is about 1 billion of school-age children over the world. And we're focusing on countries with the highest needs, so the low-income countries, but also the lower middle-income countries, which have poor primary completion rates and poor learning outcomes. And one important thing, because it also relates to climate change, is that we focus on transforming education systems so the systems are able to better cope with the 21st century's challenges that the world faces today. And that includes, obviously, building climate smart education systems, because we know that quality education can equip people with knowledge to advance climate adaptation and action, but also can help promoting more sustainable ecosystem practices and developing the skills for the learners to get integrated into the job market for developing green societies. What is important to understand in how we operate is that at the heart of our strategy is the question of system transformation, and we're working through a resource-based approach. So we build incentives in the money that we're giving to countries, because we want to make sure that our grant allocations advance system transformation at scale, speed, and support inclusion. And so that requires policy prioritization, which is not always easy in the education sector, especially when facing global massive challenges like climate change, but also a good understanding of the bottlenecks to delivery and the alignment of education stakeholders. And when we move to the next slide, I'm going to explain that the partnership approach is really the essence of how we work, because what we believe, or our working assumption, is that the alignment of actors is critical. And that's where the partnership model is rather unique, because the partnership would help ensuring that programming, resources, and expertise align with country policy priorities, and that working in partnership will help build sustainability in the policy that are being designed at country level, but also in the implementation. And more importantly, because we have a group of different actors, like you can see on the slides, it's about leveraging the partners' different assets and resources. And resources can be financial, like the money that we're giving, and leveraging money from other stakeholders, but also technical assets and resources, knowledge, political capital. So basically the idea is that the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. We can move to the next slide. So if we take the question of climate change and education, and I'm gonna do a little bit of like reflection on how we've been addressing that question so far. At GP, we've been tackling the question of climate change. I mean, we are now tackling the question of climate change and education as a two-way relationship. We're obviously not the only ones thinking education and climate this way. But for too long, in a way, we've been only essentially concentrating our efforts into building resilient education systems that can resist to various crises and disasters, including the ones that are prompted by climate change. But on the other hand, we've been fairly limited in thinking education more forcefully as a powerful and critical pillar for climate action and contributing to climate goals. And we know the impact of climate change on education. They are rather well known and documented. We know that nearly 40 million of children a year have their education interrupted by disasters, for instance, following extreme weather events, and that girls, marginalized groups, and children living in fragile situations are disproportionately affected by climate change due to their gender and socioeconomic inequality, which make them even more vulnerable to the impact of extreme weather events. But on the other hand, and I'm insisting a little bit on that point, we intuitively know that education plays a key role in giving people the knowledge and tools they need to adapt to the impact of climate change, but also for addressing the risks that climate change imposes on lives, livelihood, and well-being. And I say intuitively because all of the research work that we've been doing or promoting or coordinating, we see that there's a lot being researched in terms of like what are the impacts of climate on education systems, etc. But there's much less in terms of how education does contribute to climate action and climate goals. So that's an area where we feel like more should be done, but I'll discuss that a little bit later. There are some things that we know. There are some studies that said that quality education dramatically reduced vulnerability to death from weather disasters, for instance. And we also know that girls' education has been identified as the most important socioeconomic determinant in reducing vulnerability to climate change. We also know that children with foundational skills, literacy, numeracy, but also socio-emotional skills, help their families better process and act on information about risk. But there is still more to be unpacking here, and more research is needed. Next slide, please. So, like I said, initially this two-way relationship was not sufficiently addressed in our approach, and that's why we started conceptualizing 2 years ago in a clearer way how we see the relationship between climate and education to accelerate our efforts for building education that is resistant to climate change, but also being better leverage for climate action. And the process started with a number of GP partner countries expressing the need for support in more systematically addressing climate change in the education sector. And one concrete output of that process is the Climate Smart Education System Framework for Action that I'm going to present to you. That framework builds on work that was done by Fumio Kagawa and David Selby. And in particular, probably you're very aware of that series, the series that is called Heat Is On, commissioned by UNICEF South Asia, and I think you're speaking with them tomorrow. So that framework, we've been thinking climate smart education systems in a way that they serve 3 interrelated goals. The first one is protect and advance quality, relevant, and equitable education. So we ensure that there is education continuity in the face of disaster or disruption. but also that all of the education actors are equipped to prevent, reduce, and manage risks. That's the first goal. The second goal is protecting the planet's life system. And through education systems, because education reach into every community and should be equipping and mobilizing actors to promote sustainable environmental solutions and practices that are informed by diverse sources of cultural knowledge, values, and practices. And for instance, indigenous, nomadic, tribal people have deep understandings of human nature, interconnectedness, and the unique knowledge and skills for adapting to a changing climate and environment. I'm going to get back to that because that's going to be the cultural discussion that I'm going to have in the next slide. And then promoting global climate justice, just to make sure that the rights of the most disadvantaged and marginalized are respected in the space when they face specific challenges arising from climate and environmental change. So we have identified those 3 goals, but then the GPE countries were like, that's fine, but we need technical assistance into thinking a framework for action. So we've been aiming to develop a rather user-friendly document. You have the resource at the end of the PowerPoint that brings together critical entry points to build more climate-smart education systems, and that's based on a range of good practices that we've been reviewing. But it's a sort of generic approach, and really the idea is to shape 7 dimensions where the governments who want to adapt their education system to be more climate sensitive have the freedom to adapt and contextualize the way they want. Next slide, please. So those are the 7 dimensions of the framework. I'm going to concentrate my presentation on the inner circle when we're speaking about schools and communities. But you would see that the outer circle is the factors that we believe are conducive of an enabling environment for effectiveness and sustainability. In the blue circle, we have the inputs into the education system, and then you have gender that is basically cross-cutting. Briefly, because I don't want to take too much time, but those dimensions, when you take data and evidence, for instance, it's about collecting, analyzing, and reporting data on climate and disaster risk and environmental degradation in a systematic manner for informing decision-making, which is obviously very important, but also for facilitating peer learning and exchange between the countries, the regions, and having cooperation on innovation. Policy and planning is an interesting one because, I mean, there's plans and policies in both sectors, education and in the climate sector, but those plans usually don't talk to each other. And it's therefore quite critical that education sector plans consider disaster risk, environmental protection, and climate change goals. But it's equally important that climate and disaster risk and strategies incorporate the roles and contribution of the education sector. So there is quite a lot of work for reaching out to the climate community and policy for them to realize the value and benefits of investing into education. And when I speak about investment, that's clearly about finance. We've been doing a research very recently, and there's a lot that is needed to be understood in terms of cost and financing. The costs that the climate crisis imposes on education systems, that's something that we need to research, but also to identify the cost-effective interventions to ensure that there is sufficient and effective allocation of funds to adapting education systems to climate change. And there's also that discussion that is ongoing, and at the COP in particular this year, of like, how can we bring together international financing in the climate space and in the education space, so there is co-benefits. Education by itself, financing education does contribute to climate goals, so it would be fair that some climate financing gets into education the same way. There's also other inputs, but I'm gonna skip them because I think you've been discussing them, or probably you're going to discuss them tomorrow. But it's about teaching and learning, and it's about infrastructure. So next slide, please, so I can have a zoom in on the question of schools and community. So everything starts and ends at the community level. Schools, I mean, classrooms even, are the ultimate unit of implementation. But I mean, we believe that there's more that we can do to transform these schools into community hubs, and for multiple purposes. But for the one that interests us today, climate and environment protection, it's even more vital. We can use schools as we can turn schools as community hubs by promoting environmentally sustainable practices and by drawing on communities' members' knowledge. Schools can invite parents, community adults, elders to the classroom to share their knowledge, their lived experience about past disasters, what were their coping strategies to past hazards and changing climates. On the other hand, and I must say I'm the living proof of this because my daughters taught me absolutely everything I know about protecting our planet. Students would take back home that knowledge and share that eco-sensitive knowledge with their family and community members, and they can also bring back ideas and practices from home and share and discuss them at school. An additional element about schools. I mean, schools are built for decades, and it's imperative that school building are planned, designed, constructed, and maintained, taking into consideration the local hazards, the projected climate change trends. And if you take, for instance, school risk assessment, that can be done in a very consultative and participatory process involving the community, but it's also a very interesting practice to involve the learners, the students. When they're equipped with proper training and support, school-age children are absolutely capable of conducting risk analysis in their locality, coming up with actions that contribute to reduce disaster risk. And overall, basically, just by doing that exercise, raising awareness on climate risks and mitigation strategy. That's also the same idea that prevails when we turn schools into direct participation platforms. There's a number of examples, very efficient, where, for instance, kids are involved into tree planting, school gardening, cleaning up of the local environments, campaigning, doing exhibition on climate and environmental themes through, for instance, some school clubs, after-school activities that are organized by very enthusiastic teachers. And coming to the point of culture, when I was preparing that presentation, I was wondering whether that was a blind spot in our framework. I really appreciated that there was the word culture into the title of the session. It could be that we should be doing a little bit more. In our framework, what we're saying is that we need to include the knowledge, the local knowledge into the schools. I mean, using the schools as like community hubs, but also probably making it in a more formal way, codifying local knowledge, indigenous knowledge into contextualized curricula. And so that's one area where GP would like to accelerate a little bit thinking around that. And that would also contribute to the overall global question of decolonizing education. Next slide, please.
Raphaelle, you have 3 more minutes if you can find.
Okay, so I'm probably going to see if I only have 3 minutes. Yeah, I don't know what is the most useful at that stage. Well, so we're doing different things. Maybe, I mean, like, I can always talk about, let's move maybe to the evidence review about like what we've seen. I mean, we're doing different things in terms of evidence generation and dissemination. But if we can move to the slide, the last slide almost. Can you move on the slides? Not that one, not that one. Yes. Excellent, this one. So we're coordinating, I mean, we're using our convening power for coordinating the global level research agenda on climate and education. We have set up an interest group. And part of that, with different actors, it's a group of multilateral and bilateral agencies, departments of research and development. And we found out that actually there's a lot that is happening in the same areas and other areas that are like not very well researched. That the available studies are predominantly coming from wealthy industrialized economies, that most of the studies are small-scale case studies, but there is very little at system level, and more importantly, researching and testing the effective pathways to actual change. So that's also a call for like investing into implementation science and checking the pathways and how can we build not only theoretically and conceptually and putting all of the inputs in place for building climate smart education systems, but when implementing them, what it takes. Next slide, please. And so here it's a sort of mapping that we've been doing with different categories of research areas, sorry, not categories, areas of research. And what we can see is that there's quite substantial research being undertaken on the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation in education, but there's much less or almost no research. Again, it's not comprehensive to date. It's just very initial mapping. But there's no research specific to the impacts on marginalized communities, for instance. In most research areas that you see mapped here, like education for behavioral change, education for social and political change, education infrastructure, migration and education, school and community linkage, etc. There is some research underway, but that would deserve a bit of more coordination. So there's like bigger synergies between the agencies that are investing into research. What our mapping has identified as an area that is poorly researched and that is, I believe, and maybe even more so in the context of India, the relationship between education, climate, and population, and how slowed population growth can reduce pressure on natural resources, and what are like the dividends that can be redistributed from that. And also the other area that is not very well research is education and green skills. So how to prepare the learners to be integrated into greener economies. And finally, the point that I already made, which is like we're investing a lot of efforts that has been picking up for the past 2 years about understanding the impact of climate on education, but the impact of education on climate is much less research, and it's an important area for investing research, because that's also where we're going to be building the case for investments and advocate at higher government level for investing into education. So there is a need for having more impact evaluations of climate smart interventions in the education sector, so we can build that knowledge bases. And I'm sorry if I was too long. Thank you.